mercy! Alright, hello there, thrill seekers. That was a little bit of the song Pretty Woman because somebody said I looked like Roy Orbison in these new glasses. No relation today to today's topic, which is my long anticipated and awaited geeky rant about the Japanese language. Or geeky, not really a rant, but more like a tangent. Which on a previous video, I think on the most recent video, I made kind of an off-the-cuff statement about how I could go on for ages about the Japanese language, and nobody wanted to hear that. And then a bunch of people said they wanted to hear that. I don't know why, but let's get into it. So the way this all began, and by the way, before I start, some of the visuals are going to be lost for those of you who are now listening to this podcast as an audio podcast, but you're probably not missing that much. But there's going to be a lot of visuals in here, so I don't know. If you're listening, you might want to go later and look at it on YouTube. I don't know. But the way this all got started was I was talking about how Huangpo is known as obaku in Japan, and that threw me off for years because I didn't realize that they were the same person, and so I kind of like to let's just start with that. 3 Zen master names that always throw me. I mean, I think I've kind of gotten around to figuring it out, but I learned them in Japanese first, and then it's hard for me to make the connection between the Chinese pronunciation, so I'm just going to tell you. The first one being Obaku Kiyun, that's how I learned his name, who is most commonly known by the Mandarin pronunciation, I believe this is a Mandarin pronunciation, Huangpo Xiun. And if you're looking at it on YouTube, I'm hopefully putting the Chinese characters on the screen so you can see them. The other one that always throws me is Baizhang Huaihai, who I learned as Hyakujo Ekai, mostly Hyakujo. He's famous for the koan Hyakujo's Fox. I've done, I don't know how many videos about Hyakujo's Fox I've done on this channel. I've been fascinated by that koan for many years, and I know I've done a bunch of videos on it, and I wrote about it in my books, Sit Down and Shut Up, and It Came from Beyond Zen, and probably in other books too, so we won't belabor that point. But Hyakujo Ekai, as I learned him, is Baizhang Huaihai, and you're seeing on the screen right now, probably, if I'm able to do this. The other one that always throws me is Daikon Eno. Daikon Eno is how you hear his name in Japanese. He is also known more commonly as Dajian Huineng or Huineng. It's actually supposed to be pronounced Huineng, but it's spelled as if it's pronounced Huineng, so a lot of people think it's Huineng. And you're seeing his name on the screen right now too. These are the ones that throw me most often, but almost every Chinese Zen master has, in fact everyone I'm sure, has a Japanese pronunciation for their name and a Chinese. The easiest one is Rinzai. Rinzai is how he's pronounced. The Rinzai sect of Zen is named after a guy, Rinzai, and his Chinese pronunciation, or at least Mandarin pronunciation, is Lin Chi, which to me sounds vaguely like Rinzai, so I never had trouble figuring that one out, but the other ones really threw me. So let me give you a little bit of my journey into Japanese. As a lot of you know, I grew up kind of internationally. Lived in Africa for almost 4 years when I was a kid. My collar is weird, isn't it? Anyway, just deal with it. Those of you listening will not have to deal with my weird collar. So there you go. That's an advantage. Anyway, so I grew up internationally and surrounded by lots of languages when we would travel, and I got fascinated with the idea of learning another language, which probably if my family had stayed in Wadsworth, Ohio, which is where I wasn't born there, but I think we moved to Wadsworth when I was about 6 months old. So if I'd grown up in Wadsworth, Ohio, I might not have been as interested in languages as I am now, because there's really only one language. Maybe these days it's different, but when I was there was only one language in Wadsworth, Ohio. You didn't even see people who spoke Spanish around Wadsworth, Ohio, so at least in those days. Now I see a lot of people who speak Spanish because my wife's of Mexican descent, so I'm around Spanish-speaking people constantly. But anyway, so I got interested in languages. In fourth grade, our teacher, this is in the Nairobi International School in Nairobi, Kenya, in Africa, in case you don't know where Kenya is. There was a teacher, our teacher brought in a woman who taught us French, like, I don't know, 2 or 3 times a week. And I was really like, hey, learn French. So I learned a little bit of French, and my dad used to always congratulate me because we went to France a little bit after that happened, and I was able to steer us to pommes frites, which is French fries, because it was I knew what those were called in French, and I knew a couple of words of French. So when we traveled, we spent like, I don't know, 4 or 5 days in France at one point, and I was able to read a few things and understand a few things. So that started me on. When I got to high school, I really was pretty fascinated by Japan by then. We'd moved back from Kenya and all that, and I wanted to learn Japanese, but this is the early '80s in Wadsworth, Ohio. There were no Japanese classes, so I took French. Took 3 years of French, did okay, not great. I can still understand bits of French, not much. So that started me off. When I got to Kent State University, you have a language elective that you're supposed to take, or was it an elective? I think it was a requirement for a bachelor's degree. You had to have at least 4 semesters, or I think, of a language, and I took Japanese because finally I was in a place where it was available. Didn't do too great on Japanese at that point, but my grades kept going down. I got like an A. Look, I injured myself doing that steel guitar part in, what was that song called? Everybody's Truckin'. So that's what that is. Anyway, I didn't do that great. My grades kept going down and down and down. And then it was 5 years from my last Japanese class at KSU till I went to Japan. So what the deal was I signed up for the JET program, Japan Exchange and Teaching Program, which was a thing where they hire you, it still exists, I think, where they hire people who are native English speakers to go and be assistants of Japanese teachers of English at schools from elementary, ranging all the way up from elementary to high school. My placement was in a high school. And when you get that job, they tell you, at least in the time when I got the job, they informed you that you had the job. I can't remember, of 6 months or at least 4 months. I don't remember, but it was quite a long time before they actually send you to Japan. So I had some time to go and dig out my old Japanese books that I had when I was studying it at KSU, and I just studied like crazy. So every day I was drilling as much as possible in all of my spare time Japanese. I was working for the Summit County Board of Mental Retardation and Developmental Disabilities as a kind of substitute instructor for adults with mentally handicapped adults, basically kind of overseeing them doing really simple jobs like putting screws in a bag and things like that. So it was fairly easy work, and this gave me a certain amount of leeway where I could just be studying Japanese. I'd be kind of keeping an eye on the guys on the floor, putting the screws in the bags or whatever they were doing, and then studying Japanese at the same time. So by the time I arrived in Japan in the summer of 1992, I'm going to say, it was either 92 or 93. Maybe it was 93. Anyway, whenever I got to Japan, I had a smattering of Japanese. Like I could say a few things, understand a few things, read a few things, which actually put me way ahead of most people on the JET program, because as I just said, they don't require you to know Japanese. And so most of the people on the JET program, most of my fellow teachers or teaching assistants, I guess we were, didn't know any Japanese. So my first year in Japan, I was often the guy in my little friend group who could read a few things and say a few things. So I ended up kind of being a kind of guide for people there. I at that time bought bunches of books about Godzilla and Ultraman. Actually, this one I bought before I went to Japan, but I brought it down because it was one of the first books I ever owned in Japanese. Urutara Q, which was the show that Tsuburaya Productions made before they made Ultraman, and it's a book about that show. When I bought it, I didn't even know what it was. I didn't even know there was a show that Tsuburaya Productions made before they made Ultraman. So this was kind of neat. And so I bought a bunch of books like this and was trying to use them to study Japanese. These kind of books that are written for kids are useful in that you're not going to be able to see this. Those of you who are watching might be able to see this, but if you look at the Chinese characters, which are the more complicated characters, I'm going to get to the different kind of characters in Japanese, you will see that there are little tiny characters written on top of them, and this is also true for the smaller ones, which tell you how to pronounce those characters. This is in books for children. They're written that way. Otherwise, they don't have any pronunciation guides, so when you see those characters, you don't know how they're pronounced. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. So I'm gonna circle back to the different characters and such like, and maybe answer the question of why the Japanese pronounce the Chinese masters' names differently. But let me get on with my, how I got into Japanese. So one of the things I did maybe a few months into my first year of being in Takaoka, Japan, and being a teaching assistant was I really wanted to challenge myself on my learning and reading of Japanese. So I found this book called Ultraman o Kataru, and I looked all over the place. I'm sure I must still have my copy of it because it's very precious to me. But I bought this book called Ultraman o Kataru, which means Speaking of Ultraman, and it was by Noboru Tsuburaya, who was then the president of Tsuburaya Productions, the people that make Ultraman, and the son of Eiji Tsuburaya, the guy who basically created Godzilla. Godzilla geeks will argue about this, but let's just leave it at that for you guys. And this was a book written for adults in adult Japanese, and had no little thingies to indicate the pronunciation of the Chinese characters, which I will circle back to, promise. And so I bought a Japanese kanji dictionary, a dictionary that allows you to look up the kanji. And it's a very complicated process. So I would take this book, Noboru Tsuburaya's book, with me everywhere I went, and anytime I had a bit of free time, I would be going through those, and when I came across a Chinese character I didn't know, which was most of them, I would look it up and I would painstakingly write it into the margins of the book with the pronunciation and the meaning of the word, and the book was all marked up with those things. And when I got my, job interview at Tsuburaya Productions, I brought that book with me because the guy who was going to be interviewing me for the job at Tsuburaya Productions was Noboru Tsuburaya, the guy who wrote the book. And I showed him my book, and I showed him all the markings I'd done to try to learn it, and I think that was really impressive to him that I had learned Japanese by reading his book. So I think that really helped me get the job. So I got that job. This was after a year of being in Japan, and I moved to Tokyo because I've been in Takaoka, this little town on the other side of Japan, and moved to Tokyo, started working for Tsuburaya Productions. And the main thing that was like the biggest, most important way I learned to speak Japanese was that I was now working at this company in Tokyo, which had about 100 and some regular employees, plus maybe who knows how many, maybe another 100 or 200 for all I know, of contracted employees. So the 100 or so employees who worked in the office were full-time employees who worked for Tsuburaya Productions. The rest of the people who worked there were hired on a part-time basis to work on the shows, to make the actual television programs that we made in movies. So what would often happen with me in the international division of Tsuburaya Productions was that my boss would tell me, "Hey Brad, go ask the guys in the events department if we can have an Ultraman Taro costume for 2 weeks to send to Indonesia." because this is what we do. They do it for promotions and stuff like that. So the people in the international division, of which there were maybe 5 of us or 4 of us, it sort of fluctuated during the 10 years I worked in the Tokyo office. Those people could speak English. Nobody else in the rest of the company could speak English except for one person, who was Junko Kitazawa, who was in another division, and she could speak English. But everybody else, at best, they could understand a little bit of it, but they couldn't speak it at all. So I would have to run down to the events department and tell them that we need an Ultraman Taro costume for Indonesia, and then I'd have to have a conversation with them about the logistics of getting the costume and how, all this other stuff. And that's how I learned Japanese. I would just have to figure out how to say something to somebody in another division of the company, and then work it out, and then through the conversation, I would figure it out. So Japanese is a tough language. I basically learned it by just it's immersion, what they call immersion, and I was just there all the time. The other thing I used to do was I would have to translate things. We'd have to do a bit of publicity material or something to explain to, let's say, a licensee in Hong Kong what this new show was that we just came out with, like Busca was one of the shows. Busca was the name of the show. One of the new shows that came up while I was working there. And so I'd have to read all the material about Busca, the show, which is a show about this kind of weird character who was supposed to be an iguana, but he looked more like a teddy bear to me. Anyway, like a weird space teddy bear. So I would have to look at all the material in Japanese about Busca, read it, figure out what it said, and then translate that into English. So that was another way I learned a lot of Japanese. So let's talk about the Japanese language. I said this in the previous video, so I'll say it again. Basically, how the Japanese written language came to be is that I think it was around the year 600. If you want authoritative answers, you probably should watch a different video. But I think it was around then. The Japanese society had become settled down enough, and so instead of like raping and killing each other all the time, they had started settling down and doing sort of intellectual things. And they realized they didn't have a written language, but the Chinese had a written language, and the Koreans, whose language is actually more similar to Japanese than it is to Chinese, they had adapted adapted Chinese characters for use in their language, which they eventually abandoned. So contemporary Korean doesn't use many Chinese characters, but back in those days they did. So the Japanese said, okay, we can do the same thing. We're going to adapt the Japanese or the Chinese written language to Japanese. The problem is that the Japanese language and the Chinese language are vastly different. Grammatically speaking, in just about every way, they are vastly different languages. So, as I said in my previous video, trying to figure out how to write Japanese in Chinese characters would be about the same level of difficulty. I don't really think it would be any less difficult than trying to write English with Chinese characters. That's how different the languages are. So there got to be different systems. For example, if you take simple nouns like tree, right? And I'll put the character for tree up on the screen. So I'm not sure how that is pronounced in Chinese. I think maybe moku is how it's pronounced in Chinese, or something approximating moku. Moku is the Japanese version of the Chinese pronunciation of this word. This gets really complicated. So what the Japanese would do would be they tried out different ways of dealing with this. One was to try to sort of just learn Chinese, which is one of the reasons Dogen ended up knowing how to speak and read and write Chinese, because aristocratic people of his day still learned to speak, read, and write Japanese Chinese because it was the international language, and Japanese was definitely not. So one of the things they did was they would pronounce it Chinese style, but it became, I think, easier for Japanese people to just look at this Chinese character for tree and say in the equivalent of tree. So it's ki in Japanese, but it would be as if you were an English-speaking person trying to read Chinese, and you would see that character, and instead of bothering to read it in Chinese, you would just read it as the word tree. Or you would read the character for dog as dog. Instead of learning to say it in Chinese, you would just say dog, or inu in Japanese. But same equivalent. So that's one of the ways that the Japanese use Chinese characters. See, this gets so complicated I can't even speak it. The other thing they had to do was the Japanese had to find a way to indicate different grammatical constructions that don't exist in Chinese or that are vastly different in Chinese. So, for example, I'll put up the character for to go, iku. Iku is how you pronounce it in Japanese. So you have this word to go, and you would pronounce it as if it says go, right? So I'm hoping you're seeing the character up on the screen, and if you're just listening, don't worry about it. So what happened was, how do you say the word went? How do you say the past tense of to go? Well, which is ita or ikimashita if you want to be formal. So what the Japanese would do would be to add these little phonetic characters called hiragana after, mostly after the Chinese characters, and that would help them know whether they were looking at the word go or the word went or the word if you go, things like that. So that would help them figure out the grammar. So they had these characters called hiragana, which are phonetic. They don't have any meaning to them, unlike the Chinese characters, which I guess most people know this, but in case you don't, the Chinese characters basically represent a word or a noun or a concept. But they have a meaning to them as well as a sound. The Japanese hiragana characters don't have any meaning. They just are there for sound. Then, to make things even more complicated and difficult, around the same time as the hiragana characters were being developed, a bunch of Buddhist monks developed what are known as katakana, and they were using these characters when they were taking notes when their teacher would talk to them at a lecture or something. They would write their notes often in katakana, which was also another phonetic script, and these days katakana is used mainly for non-Japanese words. So if you have, for example, the word for ice cream in Japanese is aisukurimu. So they don't bother to really translate it. They just pronounce it Japanese style. And so a word like that is written in katakana, aisukurimu. So you can just read aisukurimu or Urutaraman. Here's a book I used often at work, Urutaraman Hakusho, which is Ultraman white paper. Actually, it says that in English too. And so the word Urutaraman is written in the katakana script because it's a foreign word. It's ultra and man, two English words. And hakusho means white paper, and haku means white, and sho means paper. But this gets even really complicated because sho would be the Chinese style pronunciation. And it would also, if you just saw that character by itself without anything else, you'd pronounce it kami, which means paper. So it gets really, really complicated to learn to read and write Japanese. It's supposedly one of the most complicated, maybe the most complicated writing system of any on this planet. But it works. Mainly, one of the reasons the Japanese never abandoned the use of kanji, because this kanji are the Chinese characters, this has been often discussed, is Japanese has a lot of, I think the word is homonym. Go look it up, kids. Words that sound alike but mean a different thing. So when you're trying to read Japanese, if you read it all in hiragana or even read it all in katakana, you could get easily confused as to what you're reading because so many words sound alike but mean something different. So the kanji helps. The kanji also helps you visually notice the word right away, and it stands out. It pops out at you, and you know the word you're reading. One of the things I did is, I don't remember where I got this piece of advice, but somebody told me, or maybe I read it in a book, that one of the ways an English speaker can learn to read Japanese is to just forget about the pronunciation, because the problem is there's not. Okay, every Chinese character in Japanese, I told you this is complicated. Every Chinese character has two readings, an on reading and a kun reading. An on reading is what's an approximation of the the Chinese sound of the word, and the kun reading is what I was telling you. You just read the word as if it's a Japanese word, and most of the characters have multiple on readings and multiple kun readings. I looked a few up this morning, and some you can get a character with 10 or more different possible pronunciations. So it's a nightmare to try to figure out how to pronounce anything. And the bit of advice I learned is the pronunciations are all over the map, as I just explained. But the meanings of the Chinese characters are fixed. They almost never change. Sometimes in compound words they change a little, but they're still related to the original meaning. And so if you learn the meanings, you can just do what the Japanese people did, only in English. You just read the word as if it's an English word. So I would see the word ki, and I would just, in my mind, just read tree, for example. That one's simple, so I didn't often do that one. But more complicated words, I would often just read as if they were English words, and just be like, I'm not going to worry about the pronunciation, because it's just going to take forever to figure it out. Also, there's a whole process for looking up a kanji character, because you don't know if you just come across a kanji character, and you don't know what these two characters mean. How are you going to look those up? And there's this whole system where you look it up according to the stroke, the number of pen strokes that you have to write to make the word. Or in the case of a word like this, which is made up of, if you can see it there, it's made up of two different characters. There's one on top and one on bottom. I'll give you a better example. The word nen in Japanese word nen is the word for mindfulness, you guys might know. And I'm going to put it on the screen right now. And the top of the word is the character for now. Ima would be how you pronounce it in Japanese. And then the bottom of the word is the character kokuro or shin, which means heart or mind. So now mind. And then you put those two characters together by sandwiching or squishing them on top of each other. And that forms the word for mindfulness, which is now mind. So that one's kind of visually easy if you understand what it means. God, this is getting complicated, and this is going on way longer than I wanted it to. So circling back to those names, let's pick an easy one. Hyakujo. Okay, Hyakujo is actually a little bit easier than the other ones I gave. Hyakujo is Baizhang Huaihai, a Zen master of Hyakujo's fox fame. And his name Hyakujo means 100 jo, and a jo is an old style measurement. I think it's about 1 meter or 1 yard in contemporary terms, more or less. So it means 100 yards. Why he was named 100 yards, I have no idea. I think because he was very tall. Was Hyakujo the tall one, or was Huangpo the tall one? I can't remember now. Anyway, for whatever reason, he was called Hyakujo. And the characters, you're actually pronouncing them in that on reading, an approximation of the Chinese reading for the names. And hyaku is the Japanese word for 100. They borrowed it from the Chinese. And jo is jo, the measurement term. So you just read it hyakujo, which it doesn't sound anything like the Chinese pronunciation Baizhang. Also, another little thing that just makes this even more ridiculous is that the Japanese pronunciations reflect of the Japanese approximation of the Chinese pronunciations reflect the way those words were pronounced in a certain region of China several hundred years ago. So in many cases, the names that the Japanese use for those ancient Chinese Zen masters are closer approximations of the way they themselves might have pronounced their own names. And that the pronunciation is shifted, in the past several hundred years. So it's so ridiculous and so complicated that I would advise you not to touch it. Don't even get anywhere near it. Don't try to learn Japanese, and don't try to figure any of this out. But That's a very, this tutorial went on for almost half an hour. I'm going to cut some out of it. But yeah, I've only scratched the surface in that much time. So there you go. It's complicated. That's maybe I should have just done it like that. Too long, TLDR, too long didn't read. It's complicated. Don't try to figure it out. Okay, that's it. That's all I'm going to say about that. I could say more, but that's all I'm going to say right now. So, if you want to donate to me buying more books in Japanese and trying to read them, because I got a whole shelf full up there, you can send me a donation at the link, at the URL that you're seeing on the screen below, or that you're about to hear me say if you're listening to me. It is hardcorezen.info/donate. That is hardcorezen.info/donate. That's where you can find my links to my PayPal and Patreon accounts. Those are my main ways of making a living. But as always, this is offered for free, so you don't gotta pay me if you don't want to pay me. All right, we will see you next time. Have a good time all the time. Sorry this was so long. Bye.